Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere very, very small, about the width of a pencil eraser. Robin's egg blue, faintly chalky, with a little letter M inside a box stamped on one side and the number 30 on the other. It looks like medicine. It looks exactly like the thing the oral surgeon handed you in a paper envelope after your wisdom teeth, back when doctors handed those out like breath mints. It is not that. It came out of a hand crank machine in a rented apartment, mixed in a bowl by a man watching a soccer match on his phone. Tonight we're telling the story of the blues, the most successful counterfeit product in American history, and the strangest part is that nobody ever bothered to make the packaging. Before you get comfortable, a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested this topic. You have no idea how much these suggestions shape what ends up here, and this one has been sitting in my notes for weeks waiting for the right night. If you enjoy what I do here, and only if you actually do, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It is always somewhere near 3 in the morning for somebody. And if you'd rather listen with your eyes shut and your phone face down, the whole channel is on Spotify now. Link is down in the description. Now dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft white noise. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up over the cold shoulder and let your jaw unclench a little. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how a pill gets counterfeited? Not a handbag, not a watch, a pill. Who does the quality control? Is there quality control? Why blue? Who sat down and decided that the fake should look nicer than the real one? How does a substance you cannot see, cannot taste, and cannot smell end up in a tablet sold on a phone app your teenager uses to send pictures of a dog? What does a pill press cost? And why is that answer somehow both boring and terrifying? How did a painkiller shortage in Ohio turn into a chemistry problem in Sinaloa? And why is it that the most dangerous object in North America for most of the last decade weighed less than a paperclip? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 2010. The economy is a smoking crater. Everyone still has a landline for some reason. And in a boardroom in Connecticut, a group of executives has just approved a small change to the formula of the best-selling painkiller in the country. They think they are solving a problem. They are, technically. They're also about to start a much worse one. Let's start with the object itself because it deserves a proper introduction. Pick it up. Roll it between your thumb and forefinger. It's light, almost weightless, chalky enough to leave a faint dust on your skin. Pale blue, the colour of a hospital gown or a robin's egg or a cheap swimming pool. On one face, a capital M set inside a small square box. On the other, the number 30, sometimes split by a score line down the middle. This is the visual signature of a 30 milligram Oxycodone tablet, a real, legitimate, federally regulated pharmaceutical product made by a real company. And the pill in your hand has never been inside a factory in its life. Think about how strange that is for a moment. You're used to counterfeits. You've seen a fake designer handbag with stitching that gives it away up close. A knockoff watch that ticks a half second too loud. A bootleg action figure with a head slightly too large for its body. Counterfeiting usually leaves a tell, some small failure of craftsmanship that separates the real from the copy if you know where to look. This one does not work that way. There is no seam to check. There is no serial number to run. The counterfeit and the original are, to the eye, to the tongue, to the fingertip, completely indistinguishable, which means the only meaningful difference between them is invisible, unmeasurable by any of your 5 senses, and capable of killing you in under an hour. Consider what that does to the ordinary human habit of trust. You trust the sealed bag of spinach because a health inspector somewhere signed off on the farm. You trust the aspirin in your medicine cabinet because a pharmacist filled it from a bottle with a lot number printed on the label. Trust in the modern world is mostly outsourced. You're not personally verifying much of anything. You're relying on a long invisible chain of other people who checked it first. The blue pill exploits exactly that habit. It looks like the end of a trustworthy chain. It is actually the end of no chain at all, just a bowl, a press, and a stranger's best guess. And here is the detail that keeps toxicologists up at night. 2 pills from the same bag, pressed 30 seconds apart on the same machine, can contain wildly different amounts of the active ingredient. One might be inert enough to do essentially nothing. The next might be, in the flat clinical language the laboratories use, potentially lethal. There is no way to tell which is which by looking, weighing, or tasting. The only test that works is a chemical one, and almost nobody in the actual moment of taking a pill has one handy. So that is your object for tonight. Something the size of an aspirin, the colour of a swimming pool, stamped with a letter that means nothing where it came from, carrying inside it either very little or entirely too much, decided not by a formula, but by however evenly a stranger happened to stir the bowl that morning. It asks nothing of you, and promises nothing back. It simply sits there, weightless, chalky, patient, waiting to be exactly what it says it is, or nothing at all like it. We will spend the rest of tonight following that little blue lie backward, through boardrooms and jungle labs and strip mall clinics and phone apps with heart emojis standing in for menus, all the way to the very unglamorous rented apartment where most of them are actually made. It starts, as these things so often do, with somebody trying to solve a completely different problem and accidentally inventing a much worse one. Before we get to the fake, you need to understand the real one, because counterfeiters are lazy in a very specific way. They copy whatever is most popular, and in the late 2000s the most popular 30mg Oxycodone tablet in America was made by a company called Mallinckrodt. That little M in the box is their maker's mark, a bit of pharmaceutical branding that nobody outside a pharmacy ever thought about twice. It exists so a nurse can identify a loose tablet on a hospital floor. It is, in other words, a trust signal, a tiny stamped promise that says a licensed facility made this and stands behind it, which makes it, from a certain angle, the single most valuable thing to steal in the entire industry. Pharmaceutical branding is a strange, quiet art form when you actually sit with it. Every legitimate tablet on the market carries some version of this signature, a shape, a colour, an embossed code, all of it designed for exactly one purpose, so that if something goes wrong, someone can trace the pill back to its source. It is essentially a return address baked directly into the product. A recall works because the markings work. A poison control center can identify an unknown tablet over the phone in under a minute, because manufacturers agreed, decades ago, to make their products legible at a glance. It is one of the quieter miracles of modern regulation, the kind of infrastructure nobody notices until it is gone. And that is precisely the vulnerability, because a system built entirely on visual trust has no defense against someone willing to simply reproduce the visual. Trademark law protects the brand name and the packaging, the box, the label, the printed insert warning you about drowsiness. It was never built to anticipate someone stealing only the tiny embossed letter on the tablet itself and leaving everything else behind. There was no packaging to counterfeit because there was no packaging at all. The pills travelled loose, in sandwich bags, in the corner of a folded receipt, in the coin pocket of a pair of jeans. The forgery target was smaller than a fingernail, and it turned out that was more than enough. Picture the actual Mallinckrodt product for a moment, the real one, manufactured under conditions so controlled they would seem almost comic if the stakes were lower. Air filtration systems, calibrated tablet presses accurate to fractions of a milligram, batch testing at multiple stages, a paper trail thick enough to satisfy federal inspectors who show up unannounced. Somewhere in that facility, a machine presses a letter into a tablet with a precision measured in microns. That letter travels eventually into a supply chain, a pharmacy, a patient's hand. And somewhere else entirely, in a room with none of that equipment, none of that oversight and none of that intention, a much cheaper machine presses the same letter into a tablet made of something else altogether. The forger never has to convince you their factory is real. They only have to convince you the letter is real, and the letter, unfortunately, is the easiest part of the whole operation to copy. It cost the original manufacturer decades of regulatory compliance to earn. It cost the counterfeiter about $40 in an afternoon. It's 2010, and Purdue Pharma has a problem. Their flagship product, Oxycodone, is a time-release tablet, and people have discovered that if you crush a time-release tablet, you get all of the time at once. So Purdue reformulates. The new pill turns into a rubbery, gummy, uncrushable mess when you try to break it down, and the company presents this as a triumph of safety engineering, which in a narrow sense it absolutely is. What it is not is a treatment. Millions of people were now physically dependent on an opioid that had, overnight, stopped being usable in the way they were using it. Demand does not evaporate because supply gets inconvenient. Demand goes shopping. Try to picture the actual mechanics of what this felt like for someone on the receiving end, because the policy language tends to flatten it. You have been taking a medication daily, sometimes for years, sometimes for a legitimate injury that never quite finished healing. Your body has adapted to its presence the way a body adapts to almost anything given enough repetition, and then, with no announcement beyond a note tucked into your pharmacy bag, the medication itself changes shape. It gums up in water. It refuses to crush. The manufacturer calls this abuse deterrence, and from a boardroom in Connecticut it reads as an unambiguous win. From the vantage point of your kitchen counter, it reads as a locked door with no explanation of where the new door might be. The engineering itself really was clever, in the way a lot of well-intentioned policy is clever right up until it meets an actual human being. The new formulation used a polymer that swelled into a viscous gel on contact with liquid, making it nearly impossible to dissolve for injection or crush into powder for snorting. Laboratory tests confirmed it worked exactly as designed. What the laboratory could not model was the person standing at the counter afterward, dependency intact, tolerance intact, options suddenly not intact at all. This is the part of the story that resists a clean villain, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that for a second instead of rushing past it. Nobody in that reformulation meeting was plotting a heroin epidemic. They were responding reasonably to genuine and well-documented abuse of the original product. The failure was not malice. It was the much quieter and much more common failure of treating a chemistry problem as though it were the whole problem, when the actual problem was sitting in millions of households with a habit the reformulation could interrupt but never once address. So the pill got harder to misuse, precisely as intended, and the dependency it left behind did not so much as blink. It simply looked around for the nearest open door, which, as it turned out, was standing wide open about 800 miles south, in a state that had spent the better part of a decade turning painkillers into a genuine tourist industry. Meanwhile, several states south, Florida had spent the previous decade running what can only be described as a pharmaceutical free-for-all. Pain clinics opened in strip malls next to nail salons and check cashing places, staffed by physicians who could see 100 patients a day, accept cash only, and write prescriptions for hundreds of tablets with the diagnostic process best described as a firm handshake. There was no statewide prescription monitoring database, which meant a person could visit 6 clinics in an afternoon and no computer anywhere would notice. Cars drove down Interstate 75 with Kentucky and Ohio plates, filled their trunks, and drove home. They called it the Oxy Express. Somebody actually printed T-shirts. Walk through the geography of it for a second, because the map tells you almost everything. At the peak of this era, the state of Florida was home to something like 9 out of every 10 oxycodone dispensing physicians in the entire country. Not 9 out of 10 in the Southeast, 9 out of 10 in the United States, full stop. Concentrated overwhelmingly in a handful of counties around Fort Lauderdale and Broward. A single clinic could dispense more oxycodone in 1 month than an entire hospital system in another state dispensed in a year. This was not a black market operating in shadows. It was a storefront business with hours posted on the door and parking available out back. The clinics themselves developed a kind of house style, if you can call it that. Waiting rooms with dozens of chairs, television screens playing daytime programming, a receptionist behind bulletproof glass collecting cash, because insurance companies had, sensibly, refused to touch any of it. The physical exam, where one occurred at all, might involve a blood pressure cuff and a cursory glance at an old MRI. The actual product, the prescription itself, was frequently already written before the patient sat down, adjusted only slightly based on how much cash was in the envelope. And the customers were not exclusively locals. They came up the interstate in caravans, sometimes literally organized by a single sponsor, who paid for gas and clinic fees in exchange for a cut of the pills, a role that earned the descriptive and entirely unglamorous nickname of the sponsor. A car would leave Kentucky at 4 a.m, hit 3 or 4 clinics over the course of the day, fill the prescriptions at a handful of pharmacies willing to look the other way, and drive back north before midnight, with a trunk full of tablets destined for towns that had, until recently, had no meaningful drug trade to speak of at all. It is worth noticing what made this entire system possible, because it was not corruption in the dramatic sense. It was the simple absence of one boring piece of infrastructure, a shared database. No agency anywhere could see that the same patient had visited 4 clinics in one day, because no 2 of those clinics were required to talk to each other. The pipeline did not run on malice so much as on the gap between systems that never bothered to compare notes, which is a theme, if you are keeping track, that will return. Then, quite suddenly, the party ended. Florida built its monitoring database, raided the clinics, arrested the doctors, and shut the pipeline down with genuine and admirable force. Prescribing guidelines tightened nationwide. Doctors who had been handing out 90-day supplies for a sprained ankle got nervous and began tapering patients off, sometimes gently, often not. And here is where the story turns, because none of that crackdown came bundled with treatment. You cannot arrest a withdrawal. Several million Americans were left holding a physical dependency and an empty prescription pad, and into that vacuum walked a product that required no doctor at all. The enforcement effort, to its credit, worked exactly as designed on its own narrow terms. Task forces raided dozens of clinics in a single coordinated sweep. Physicians who had been writing thousands of prescriptions a month found themselves facing federal indictments instead. The prescription monitoring database, once it finally existed, closed the multi-clinic loophole almost overnight. Within a couple of years, the number of oxycodone pills dispensed in the state of Florida dropped by more than half. If you are grading this purely as a law enforcement operation, it deserves close to a perfect score. But a law enforcement operation is, definitionally, only equipped to remove supply. It has no mechanism whatsoever for treating the dependency that the supply created, and dependency does not respond to a raid. Picture the actual population caught in the middle of this. A woman in her 40s with a herniated disc from a decade of warehouse work, tapered off her medication over a matter of weeks by a doctor who had, quite reasonably, become terrified of losing his license. Her pain did not improve because the prescription ended. Her withdrawal, however, arrived right on schedule, indifferent to the fact that the crackdown targeting her supplier had been, by every measure, a success. Nationwide prescribing guidelines followed close behind, and they followed the same logic at a much larger scale. The Centers for Disease Control issued formal recommendations urging physicians toward far more conservative opioid prescribing, and insurers began flagging and denying long-term opioid claims that would have sailed through without comment 5 years earlier. Again, reasonable on its face. Again, entirely one-sided in its effect. Supply contracted hard and fast. The population that has been built on that supply contracted not at all. What followed was less a single dramatic pivot than a slow, uneven, individually negotiated migration, patient by patient, each one solving the same withdrawal in whatever way was locally available. For some that meant methadone clinics, for some it meant nothing at all, and for a great many it meant heroin, which by this point had quietly become cheaper, more available, and considerably less bureaucratic than anything requiring a doctor's signature. The pipeline had been closed. The pressure that built it had not been relieved. It had simply been redirected downhill toward whatever channel happened to be open. The pharmacology did the rest. Oxycodone and heroin are close enough cousins that the body barely files a complaint about the switch, and heroin in 2011 cost a fraction of what a black market pill did, so the bridge got walked by hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom had begun this journey with a legitimate injury and a legitimate prescription. Heroin deaths quadrupled over the following few years. This was the second wave, and public health officials watched it arrive with a sense of grim recognition, because they had seen this shape before. What almost nobody saw coming was that heroin was the calm part. Consider the actual economics for a moment, because they explain almost the entire migration without needing any additional theory. A single black market 30 milligram oxycodone tablet at the peak of the post-crackdown shortage could run $30 or more on the street. A comparable dose of heroin, delivering a broadly similar effect on the same opioid receptors, might cost a tenth of that. For someone maintaining a daily physical dependency, a habit that has nothing to do with getting high and everything to do with simply feeling normal enough to function, that price difference is not a preference. It is the entire decision, made for you by your own bank account. Researchers studying this period found something that should have been the headline and somehow rarely was. The demographic profile of heroin users had fundamentally changed. This was no longer primarily an urban phenomenon concentrated in populations with long histories of injection drug use. Survey after survey found that a substantial majority of people starting heroin in this era had first misused a prescription opioid, and a striking number of them lived in suburban and rural communities that, a decade earlier, had reported essentially zero heroin use of any kind. The drug had not so much spread as arrived, fully formed, riding on a bridge built entirely out of pharmaceutical dependency. And unlike a pill obtained from a licensed pharmacy, heroin's potency was never standardized to begin with, which meant this population, already unaccustomed to street-level uncertainty, was stepping directly into a product with a far wider and far more dangerous range of concentration than anything they had encountered on a pharmacy label. Overdose deaths involving heroin rose from roughly 3,000 a year at the start of the decade to well over 10,000 within a few years, a climb steep enough that epidemiologists began referring to it, without much exaggeration, as the second wave of the crisis, following directly behind the first wave of prescription pills the way a wave behind it always does. What almost nobody working in public health at that particular moment fully appreciated, and this is worth sitting with, is that heroin, for all its genuine danger, still came from something resembling agriculture. Poppies had to be grown, harvested, refined, and moved. A process with natural bottlenecks, natural inefficiencies, and natural limits on how fast supply could scale. That built-in ceiling was about to disappear entirely, replaced by a synthetic molecule that required no farm, no season, and no patience whatsoever. Fentanyl was invented in 1959 by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen, and for most of its existence it has been one of the genuinely great achievements of modern medicine. It is the reason open-heart surgery is survivable. It is in the patch on your grandmother's shoulder blade during her final weeks, and it is the reason those weeks are bearable. None of what follows is fentanyl's fault, any more than the fault lies with the concept of fire. It is simply that fentanyl is roughly 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine by weight, and in the legitimate world that potency is managed by pharmacists with calibrated equipment. In the other world it is managed by a guy named Dave. Janssen developed the molecule while searching for an anesthetic that could act faster and clear the body more quickly than morphine, sparing surgical patients the lingering grogginess that made recovery from major operations so unpleasant. He succeeded spectacularly. Fentanyl remains, to this day, one of the most widely used anesthetics on Earth, present in essentially every operating room you've ever been wheeled into, delivered in doses so precisely measured that an anesthesiologist can adjust a patient's level of sedation in real time, minute by minute, the way you might adjust the volume on a car radio. That precision is the entire point, and it is also the entire problem once the molecule leaves the hospital. In a clinical setting, fentanyl is administered by weight, by patient history, by continuous monitoring of breathing and heart rate, with a reversal agent sitting on a nearby tray in case anything goes sideways. Outside that setting, none of those safeguards travel with the molecule. The chemical does not know it has left a hospital. It behaves exactly the same way in a rented apartment as it does in an operating room, which is precisely the trouble, because nothing else in that apartment behaves anything like an operating room. To grasp the scale problem here, it helps to think in terms of transport rather than chemistry. A kilogram of heroin, sufficiently pure, might supply a meaningful regional market for weeks. A kilogram of fentanyl, cut and pressed into counterfeit tablets, can supply the same market for months, because so little of it is required per dose. That means smaller shipments, smaller packages, smaller physical footprints at every single stage of a smuggling operation that used to require trucks, and now, in principle, could fit inside a padded envelope. The molecule that made surgery survivable also happened to solve, almost accidentally, the single hardest logistical problem in the entire illegal drug trade. Nobody designed fentanyl to be trafficked. It was designed, quite literally, to save lives on an operating table, and it still does that every single day in hospitals you will never think twice about. But potency is potency regardless of who is holding the syringe or running the press, and once organised trafficking groups noticed what that potency implied for their business model, The entire shape of the American drug supply was about to change faster than any regulation could keep pace with. Here is the business case, and it is bleak in how sensible it is. Heroin requires poppies. Poppies require land, water, farmers, a growing season, a harvest, and a mountain range that can be photographed by satellites. Fentanyl requires a room. It requires precursor chemicals shipped in unmarked drums, some glassware, ventilation of dubious quality, and a person with an undergraduate understanding of organic chemistry. No fields, no seasons, no weather. And the finished product is so potent by weight that a quantity you could mail in a padded envelope replaces a quantity you would previously have needed a truck for. Every logistical problem in the drug trade simply dissolved. If this were a legal industry, it would be a case study at Harvard. Walk through the old model for a moment, because the contrast is what makes the shift so stark. Poppy cultivation ties a trafficking organization to a physical location for months at a time, visible from above, vulnerable to crop eradication programs, dependent on weather nobody can control, and on farmers who need to be paid, protected, and occasionally threatened into compliance. The entire supply chain from seed to street might take the better part of a year and pass through dozens of hands, each one a potential point of failure, informant, or law enforcement intercept. Synthetic production collapses nearly all of that into a single indoor process that can be relocated in an afternoon. There is no crop to eradicate because there is no crop. There is no harvest season dictating supply, which means production can scale up or down in response to demand within days rather than seasons. And because the finished product is active in such vanishingly small quantities, the physical volume that needs to move across a border shrinks by a factor that makes the old smuggling math look almost quaint. Where a heroin shipment once needed to be measured in kilograms hidden inside vehicle panels, an equivalent fentanyl shipment can be measured in grams tucked into ordinary mail. The economics compound from there. Precursor chemicals, the raw ingredients used to synthesize the final product, are legitimate industrial compounds with dozens of legal uses, manufactured cheaply and at enormous scale by chemical companies that have no idea and often no way of knowing what a given order will ultimately become. Buying precursor chemicals cost a small fraction of what buying finished heroin would cost, and the markup on the other end, once those chemicals are transformed and pressed into counterfeit tablets, is enormous, even by the already generous standards of drug trafficking. None of this required cartels to invent anything new, so much as recognize what was already sitting in front of them. A molecule invented for operating rooms turned out to solve, more completely than any previous innovation in the illegal drug trade, the fundamental tension between potency, cost, and concealability. Every criminal enterprise on Earth is, underneath the violence and the theatre, a logistics business looking for efficiency. This one had simply been handed the most efficient product imaginable, and it did not take long at all for word to travel. Of course, you still need the ingredients, and for years those came out of chemical manufacturing hubs in China, sold openly online by companies with professional websites, customer service representatives, and money-back guarantees on delivery. Under diplomatic pressure, China scheduled fentanyl and its analogues as a class in 2019, which was a genuine and significant policy win, and which changed the trade by roughly the amount you'd expect. The manufacturers simply pivoted to selling the ingredients for the ingredients. Precursor sourcing spread to India, shipments got relabeled. The chemistry moved one step upstream and carried on, because the one thing chemistry is extremely good at is having more than one route to the same place. It is worth pausing on just how ordinary this all looked from the outside, because the picture people tend to imagine, shadowy figures in unmarked warehouses, bears almost no resemblance to what investigators actually found. Some of these chemical suppliers operated the way any legitimate business-to-business exporter operates, with searchable product catalogues, bulk pricing tiers, and support staff who answered questions over chat about shipping timelines and customs paperwork. The transaction felt by design indistinguishable from ordering laboratory equipment for a university chemistry department, because in a formal legal sense that is often exactly what it resembled, right up until the final step. The 2019 scheduling decision genuinely mattered, and it is worth giving credit where it is due, rather than treating every policy response in this story as futile. Scheduling fentanyl and its chemical relatives as a controlled class, rather than regulating each individual variant one at a time, closed a loophole that had allowed manufacturers to tweak a single molecule slightly and market the result as a technically legal new substance. For a period, seizures of finished fentanyl originating directly from Chinese exporters did measurably decline. What replaced it was not a shortage but a redirection, and the redirection followed a pattern that shows up again and again throughout this entire story. Regulate the finished product, and the trade moves one step back up the supply chain to something not yet regulated. Precursor chemicals, the building blocks used to synthesize fentanyl rather than fentanyl itself, generally carry far looser export restrictions, since the same compounds often have entirely legitimate industrial and pharmaceutical uses having nothing to do with opioids at all. Manufacturers in China and increasingly in India began exporting these precursors instead, technically compliant with the letter of the new restrictions while supplying exactly the same downstream demand. The shipments themselves grew more creative in their paperwork, labelled as industrial solvents, as fertilizer components, as compounds bound for cosmetics manufacturing, each label technically defensible, and each one requiring a customs inspector with both the expertise and the time to notice the discrepancy. Chemistry, it turns out, does not care how many scheduling classifications a government adds. There is almost always another synthetic pathway, another precursor, another supplier, one legal step removed, and the entire cat-and-mouse arrangement has continued in this fashion, one redirection at a time, for the better part of a decade now. Now we arrive at the machine, and it is genuinely disappointing to look at. A tablet press is a squat metal thing that looks like a cross between a drill press and a vending machine. Legitimate ones fill pharmaceutical factories and cost as much as a house. But small ones exist, hand-cranked benchtop models designed for supplement companies and university labs, and they are not expensive. Neither are the dies, the little steel stamps that punch the shape and the marking into the tablet. You can order a die that says M in a box. You can order a die that says anything. Somewhere out there is a man whose entire job is machining counterfeit pharmaceutical stamps, and he almost certainly considers himself a craftsman. There is something almost anticlimactic about seeing photographs of seized presses in evidence rooms, because they look, without exception, exactly like what they legally are. Small-scale manufacturing equipment of the sort a vitamin startup or a college pharmacology department might reasonably own. The legitimate market for compact tablet presses is real and substantial, populated by supplement companies pressing their own protein tablets, small pharmaceutical compounding operations, and hobbyists making their own mints and lozenges. A press by itself, sitting on a table, tells an investigator almost nothing about intent. It is the die, the small steel punch fitted into the press that stamps a particular shape and marking into each tablet, where the actual crime announces itself. Dyes are manufactured by specialized machine shops, some of them entirely legitimate operations serving the legal supplement and pharmaceutical industries, and some of them, evidently, willing to accept a custom order for a shape and a marking that any reasonably informed person would recognize as belonging to a controlled prescription medication. Investigations have turned up dyes stamped with the markings of nearly every widely diverted prescription drug on the market, ordered the way you might order a custom rubber stamp for a small business, paid for online, shipped in ordinary packaging, arriving with no more scrutiny than a set of novelty cookie cutters. Once assembled, a modest benchtop press of this kind can produce several thousand tablets in a single working day, run by one or two people with no specialized training beyond whatever they picked up from an online forum or a willing mentor. There is no license required to purchase one, no meaningful registry tracking who owns them, and no way for a customs inspector examining an incoming package to distinguish a press destined for a legitimate supplement business from one destined for a rented apartment with the blinds drawn. What makes this particular piece of equipment so quietly unsettling is precisely its ordinariness. It requires no exotic expertise, no hard-to-source specialty parts, no criminal underworld connections beyond a working internet connection and a credit card. The single most consequential machine in this entire story, the device that transforms a bag of powder into something that looks convincingly like medicine, is available for purchase in broad daylight, and the only thing standing between that transaction and a batch of counterfeit pills is a customer's intention, which is precisely the one thing no shipping manifest has ever been able to record. There is a genuinely fascinating question buried in all of this, which is why the pills are blue. Fentanyl powder is white. Filler is white. The pressed tablet has no reason to be any colour at all, and the dye is an extra step, an extra cost, and an extra chemical to source. They do it anyway, because the counterfeit is not being sold as fentanyl, it is being sold as oxycodone, and oxycodone is blue. So somewhere in the supply chain there is a quality control conversation happening about hue. Someone is holding a tray up to the light and saying, "This batch came out too pale, do it again." A criminal enterprise that cannot be bothered to measure its active ingredient will absolutely rerun a batch for being the wrong shade of blue. It's worth sitting with how deliberate this actually is, because it reveals something about the entire operation that the danger tends to overshadow. This is not sloppiness across the board. It is selective, almost surgical sloppiness, applied with total indifference to the one variable that could save a life, and with genuine care applied to the one variable that closes a sale. The dye used is typically an inexpensive pigment, sourced the same way a candle maker might source colorant, mixed into the binder before pressing so it distributes through the tablet rather than sitting only on the surface. Getting an even, convincing shade requires exactly the kind of careful mixing that the active ingredient itself never receives. Consider the logic from the seller's side of the counter for a moment, because it is coldly rational once you follow it through. A buyer examining a tablet before a purchase has almost no tools available to them. They cannot test potency on a street corner. They cannot verify a manufacturing lot. What they can do, instantly and for free, is look at the colour and compare it against the pill they remember from a legitimate prescription, or a photograph they saw online, or a friend's description. Colour is the only quality signal available to an untrained buyer in the middle of a transaction, and so colour is the only quality signal the seller has any incentive to get right. This produces a strange inversion worth pointing out directly. The visual counterfeit is, in a narrow technical sense, more reliable than the chemical one. Photographs of seized batches show remarkably consistent shades of blue, consistent size, consistent stamped markings, batch after batch, seizure after seizure, across operations that have no connection to one another. Meanwhile, toxicology reports on tablets pulled from the very same seizures show potency varying by a factor of 10 or more from one pill to the next, sometimes within the same small bag. The counterfeit succeeded completely at the one job that mattered for making a sale and failed completely, by simple indifference, at the one job that would have mattered for keeping the buyer alive. There is a bleak kind of clarity in that gap once you really look at it. Nobody involved in producing these tablets was setting out to create a lottery, but a lottery is precisely what indifference to one variable and diligence toward another produces when the variable being ignored happens to be the one measured in micrograms. The blue tells you the seller cared enough to make a convincing product. It tells you absolutely nothing about what convinced you to trust it, which was never really the colour at all, but the years of legitimate manufacturing that taught you, correctly, to trust a blue pill with a letter stamped into it in the first place. Here is the part of the story that explains everything else. Making a tablet means blending a tiny amount of active drug into a large amount of inert filler, and blending it evenly is not a casual task. Pharmaceutical manufacturers use tumbler mixers, validated blend times, and testing at multiple points in the batch, because if the mixing is imperfect, the drug clumps. Clandestine producers use a bowl, or a paint mixer, or a cement mixer, which is not a joke and has been photographed in evidence. The result is what chemists dryly call the chocolate chip cookie effect, where the active ingredient is distributed through the batch like chips through dough. Some cookies get 3 chips, some get 20. You cannot tell which is which by looking, and neither can the man who made them. The comparison is not just colourful language borrowed for effect. It is the actual term researchers and forensic chemists use when explaining this phenomenon to people outside the field, precisely because it maps so well onto an experience almost everyone has had in an actual kitchen. Stir chocolate chips into cookie dough by hand, without careful measuring or mechanical mixer running long enough to achieve true uniformity, and you will end up with some cookies that are practically solid chocolate, and others with barely a chip in sight, despite every cookie coming from the exact same bowl of dough. Scale that same uneven mixing up to a batch of several thousand tablets, and swap the chocolate chips for a substance active in micrograms, and you have more or less exactly reproduced the mechanism that determines who lives and who does not. Legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing spends enormous resources solving precisely this problem, because manufacturers understand it as the single greatest technical risk in tablet production. Industrial blending equipment is validated through a process that can take months, testing blend uniformity at dozens of points throughout a batch, adjusting mixing time, mixing speed, and particle size until the active ingredient is distributed with a consistency that regulatory agencies require to be demonstrated statistically before a single tablet is sold. This is not bureaucratic overcaution. It is the direct, hard-won answer to a problem that clandestine producers have never had the equipment, the training, or frankly the motivation to solve. What makes this especially unforgiving in the specific case of fentanyl is the interaction between two separate problems that, individually, might each be survivable, but which compound each other catastrophically when combined. The first problem is potency. A genuinely tiny quantity separates an active dose from a fatal one. The second problem is mixing. A bowl or a cement mixer cannot achieve anything close to the uniformity of an industrial blender. Put those two problems together, and you get a batch where any individual tablet might contain, by pure chance of where it happened to sit in the mixing bowl, several times more or less active ingredient than its neighbour sitting right beside it in the same bag. This is, in the end, the single most important fact in this entire story, more important than any cartel, any chemist, any policy failure. The counterfeit pill crisis is not fundamentally a story about a dangerous drug. Fentanyl, dosed correctly, is a medicine millions of people receive safely every single day. It is a story about a dangerous absence of mixing equipment, which turns an otherwise manageable chemical into something closer to a roll of the dice, batch after batch, cookie after cookie, with nobody involved able to tell you in advance which one you happen to get. To understand why uneven mixing matters here and not, say, in vitamin C tablets, you need to sit with the scale of the numbers for a moment. Fentanyl is dosed in micrograms. A microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. The difference between a dose that produces an effect and a dose that stops a person breathing is not measured in the kind of quantity a human eye can perceive, or a kitchen scale can weigh, or a spoon can level off. It is a quantity best imagined as a few grains of table salt subdivided. Every legitimate pharmaceutical process on Earth is designed around the terror of this number. The counterfeit process is designed around getting the blue right. Try to hold the actual physical scale of this in your mind, rather than letting the word microgram slide past as an abstraction, because the abstraction is exactly what makes the danger so easy to underestimate. A single grain of table salt weighs somewhere in the neighbourhood of 60 micrograms. A lethal dose of fentanyl for someone without opioid tolerance can fall within a range not dramatically larger than that single grain. Now picture trying to divide 1 grain of salt evenly among a batch of 1,000 cookies stirred by hand, and you begin to understand why the phrase margin of error, ordinary and almost boring in most contexts, becomes something closer to a matter of life and death here. Compare this to a substance like vitamin C, where the difference between a typical dose and a genuinely dangerous one spans not micrograms but grams, a gap so enormous that even wildly uneven, mixing in a homemade batch would be extraordinarily unlikely to produce a harmful tablet. Most substances people manufacture at home, legally or otherwise, enjoy this kind of generous safety margin, wide enough that amateur equipment and amateur technique simply cannot concentrate enough of the active ingredient in one spot to cause serious harm. Fentanyl inverts that entirely. Its safety margin is so narrow that even equipment designed with genuine care could produce dangerous variation, and the equipment actually being used was never designed with care in the first place. This is also why comparisons to previous drug crises, however well-intentioned, tend to understate what is happening now. Heroin, whatever its dangers, carries a wider margin between an ordinary dose and a fatal one, which is part of why heroin users could, with experience, develop something resembling a working knowledge of their own tolerance and their supply's rough strength. Fentanyl removes that margin almost entirely and removes it silently, with no taste, no smell, and no visible difference between a tablet that will produce a mild effect and one that will not let you wake up. The arithmetic here is not a metaphor for the danger. It is the entire mechanism of the danger, expressed as a number so small that it sits below the threshold of ordinary human perception, ordinary kitchen tools, and ordinary intuition about how careful you would need to be to get this wrong. Nobody pressing these tablets by hand is doing math at the scale the chemistry actually demands. They are eyeballing a bowl, and the bowl does not know and cannot know when it has just crossed a line measured in grains of salt. For years this was all inference, and then the Drug Enforcement Administration started testing seized tablets at scale and publishing the results, which turned inference into something much colder. Their laboratories reported that a substantial share of the counterfeit pills they analysed contained what they classified as a potentially lethal dose, and that the figure was getting worse, not better, year over year. Note the phrasing carefully because it matters. Not a lethal dose, a potentially lethal one, dependent entirely on the tolerance of whoever swallowed it, which is the whole problem in a single sentence. The pill has no idea who's about to take it, and neither does anyone else in the transaction. The testing methodology itself is worth understanding, because it explains why the numbers carry the weight they do rather than reading as an alarmist estimate. DEA forensic laboratories pull representative samples from seized batches of counterfeit tablets and run them through mass spectrometry, a technique capable of identifying not just the presence of a substance, but its precise concentration down to fractions of a milligram. This is not guesswork or extrapolation from a handful of anecdotal cases. It is the same category of analytical chemistry used in criminal trials, applied here at a scale large enough to generate a genuine statistical picture of what is actually circulating in the illegal supply. What that picture showed, released periodically as public alerts, was a proportion of tested tablets containing what the agency defined as a potentially lethal dose that climbed steadily across successive testing periods, eventually settling at a level that meant a meaningful share, not a rare outlier but a real and substantial fraction of every batch tested carried enough fentanyl to kill an opioid-naive person outright. And crucially, this figure did not represent some worst-case tail end of production. It represented the ordinary, unremarkable output of the process described in the two segments before this one: a bowl, a cement mixer, a chocolate chip cookie distributed unevenly through a batch that nobody along the chain had bothered, or been able, to test before it reached the street. The phrase potentially lethal deserves the emphasis the agency itself gave it, because it captures something the public conversation around this crisis frequently flattens into simpler, scarier, and less accurate language. Not every tablet containing that concentration will kill everyone who takes it. Tolerance varies enormously between individuals, and a dose that would be fatal to someone with no opioid exposure might produce a milder effect in someone with an existing habit. But tolerance is not something a buyer can see printed on a bag, and it is certainly not something the tablet itself carries any awareness of. The laboratory can tell you, after the fact, exactly what was in a given batch. It cannot tell you before the fact who was about to take it, and neither in the vast majority of cases could anyone standing in the room at the time. This is the number that public health messaging eventually tried to build an entire campaign around, because it was, unlike so much of the language used in decades of prior drug warnings, simply and verifiably true. In 2021, the DEA launched a public awareness campaign built around a slogan of admirable bluntness, and put it on billboards, bus shelters, and every social media platform that would take the ad by. The message was not the usual anti-drug messaging, the kind that told a generation of listeners that a single puff of anything would ruin their lives and thereby taught them to disbelieve the entire genre. This one was narrower and, crucially, true. It was not saying that drugs are bad. It was saying that the specific pill you've been handed is not what the person handing it to you believes it is. Whether that distinction survived contact with a 16-year-old's attention span is a different segment. It is worth acknowledging honestly what the campaign was up against, because decades of prior drug education had left behind a genuine credibility problem that no amount of good intention could simply erase overnight. earlier generations of anti-drug messaging had built a reputation, deserved in many cases for exaggeration, for treating marijuana and heroin as though they belonged on the same shelf of consequence, for scare tactics so broad and so detached from the lived experience of teenagers that the entire genre had become something closer to a punchline than a warning. A generation raised on that messaging had learned, reasonably, to discount official drug warnings as categorically unreliable. The one pill can kill campaign tried something narrower, and in its narrowness, something genuinely more honest. It made no claims about marijuana, about occasional drinking, about the vast majority of substances teenagers might reasonably encounter and survive without incident. It focused entirely on one very specific and very verifiable fact: that counterfeit pills sold as prescription medication increasingly contained fentanyl, that the amount contained was unpredictable, and that a person could die from a single tablet without any prior indication that anything was wrong. This was not moral panic dressed up as data. It was data, full stop, delivered without the usual embellishment. Whether the message actually reached its intended audience in a form they could absorb and act on is genuinely harder to say, and the honest answer sits somewhere in the middle. Surveys conducted after the campaign's launch found meaningfully increased awareness among teenagers and young adults that pills purchased outside a pharmacy might contain fentanyl, which represents real progress against a backdrop of near-total unawareness only a few years earlier. But awareness of a risk and behaviour change in response to that risk are two very different things, and plenty of researchers studying this period noted that a headline fact absorbed in the abstract does not always translate into caution in the specific, social, often impulsive moment when an actual pill is actually being offered by an actual friend. What the campaign did accomplish, at minimum, was replacing a vague cultural sense that pills were somehow safer than street drugs with a specific, falsifiable, and unfortunately accurate warning. That the warning arrived years into a crisis that had already claimed an enormous number of lives is its own kind of tragedy. But better late messaging is still better than the alternative, which was silence. The distribution model deserves its own chapter, because it is the part that broke every assumption law enforcement had been operating on for 50 years. There was no corner, there was no alley, no exchange of glances, no adult in a car. There was a social media app with disappearing messages, an account handle, and a vocabulary of emoji that functioned as a menu. A blue heart, a snowflake, a little school bus. Each one a product code, each one adjusted the moment the platform's moderation systems learned the last one. The delivery arrived by courier or by a kid on an electric scooter. The entire transaction took 11 minutes and left less evidence than ordering a burrito. Consider what this actually replaced, because the contrast tells you everything about why enforcement strategies built for one era failed so completely against the next one. The traditional model of street-level drug distribution that law enforcement had spent decades studying, infiltrating and prosecuting depended on physical territory, on visible relationships between buyer and seller, on informants who could describe faces and locations, on surveillance that could photograph a hand-to-hand exchange from an unmarked van parked down the block. Entire units, entire careers, entire legal precedents had been built around that physical, geographically anchored model. The platform-based model discarded almost every element that made the old approach possible. There was no corner to stake out, because the storefront existed inside an encrypted messaging thread that could be created and abandoned in minutes. There was no informant network capable of mapping it, because the seller's actual identity might be known to almost nobody beyond a screen name and a phone number tied to a prepaid card. And there was no meaningful surveillance angle, because disappearing message features built into these platforms for entirely legitimate privacy reasons meant that the evidence of a transaction could vanish automatically within hours of being sent, long before any investigator even knew to look. The emoji system itself evolved with a speed that mirrored, almost exactly, the cat and mouse pattern seen everywhere else in this story. Platforms, once alerted to the practice, began flagging and removing content containing certain known drug-related emoji combinations, and sellers simply rotated to new ones, adjusting their private vocabulary within the same conversation thread the moment an old code stopped working. A snowflake might mean one thing this month and nothing at all the next, understood only by the small network of buyers who had learned the current key directly from the seller, making any attempt at automated platform-wide detection a permanently moving target. What makes this genuinely different from prior eras is speed and proximity. A transaction that once required a buyer to travel somewhere, meet someone, and negotiate in person now required nothing more than a phone already sitting in a teenager's pocket, already open to an app used constantly for entirely ordinary reasons, with a seller who might live blocks away and a courier who could arrive faster than a pizza. The barrier between wanting something and having it, which had always been the one reliable point where intervention, hesitation, or simple inconvenience might interrupt a bad decision, had effectively disappeared. And here is where the story stops being an economics lecture. The people dying were not, by and large, the population that overdose statistics had trained the country to picture. They were teenagers taking what they believed to be a Percocet before a party, or a Xanax for a panic attack, or an Adderall before a final exam. Some had never taken anything before, many took one. The death rate among adolescents roughly doubled over a 2-year stretch, while overall adolescent drug use was remarkably flat or falling. Fewer kids were using, and more kids were dying, which is a statistical shape that should not be possible, and which points at exactly one explanation. Sit with that specific statistical shape for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the strangest and most important patterns in this entire crisis. Every prior wave of concern about teenage drug use, going back decades, has followed the same intuitive relationship. More kids trying drugs generally means more overdoses, and fewer kids trying drugs generally means fewer overdoses. Rates of adolescent substance use in this particular period, tracked by long-running national surveys, showed no such increase. If anything, several measures showed modest declines, part of a broader long-term trend of younger generations experimenting with drugs and alcohol somewhat less than their predecessors did at the same age. And yet overdose deaths among that same age group climbed sharply, doubling within a remarkably compressed window of time. The only variable capable of explaining that divergence is not how many kids were using, but what they thought they were using and what they actually received instead. A teenager buying what they believed to be a single Xanax bar for a stressful week, or a single Percocet borrowed from a friend's medicine cabinet reputation, is engaging in behavior that has existed in some form for as long as medicine cabinets have. What changed was not the behavior. What changed was that the object obtained through that behavior had, without any warning printed anywhere, become something entirely different and vastly more dangerous. Case reviews conducted by medical examiners in this period repeatedly found the same profile recurring. A young person with no documented substance use history, no prior overdose, often no indication of significant drug involvement at all beyond this single incident, found to have died from fentanyl toxicity after taking what toxicology and scene evidence indicated was believed to be a counterfeit pill resembling a common prescription medication. These were not, in the language the crisis had trained the public to expect, long-time users whose luck finally ran out. They were, disproportionately, first-timers, or near enough to it that the distinction barely mattered. This is the detail that finally moved the crisis out of policy journals and into school auditoriums, because it broke the comfortable assumption that this was someone else's tragedy, confined to a population parents could imagine as distant from their own households. The chocolate chip cookie problem, it turned out, did not check anyone's resume before deciding how many chips they got. Blues were the flagship, but they were never the whole product line. The same presses, the same dyes, the same bowls of unevenly mixed powder produced counterfeit alprazolam bars, counterfeit hydrocodone, and counterfeit amphetamine tablets for a market of college students who had convinced themselves that a study aid did not count as a drug. The counterfeit benzodiazepine market was particularly grim because the people buying those were often buying them for anxiety and insomnia, which meant the pill was being taken alone, at night, in bed, by someone who had told nobody. Every safeguard that might have helped, someone nearby, someone awake, someone with a phone, was structurally absent by design. It is worth pausing on the specific cruelty of the benzodiazepine variant, because the circumstances surrounding its typical use amplify the underlying danger in ways that make it, in some respects, even more insidious than the counterfeit oxycodone that gets most of the public attention. A counterfeit stimulant sold to a student cramming for an exam is typically consumed in a shared space, during waking hours, around other people who might notice something wrong. A counterfeit benzodiazepine sold to someone hoping simply to fall asleep is consumed, almost by definition, in exactly the opposite circumstances. Alone, at night, with the explicit goal of losing consciousness, in a setting where the earliest warning signs of an overdose, slowed breathing, unresponsiveness, are indistinguishable from the sleep the person was trying to achieve in the first place. The counterfeit alprazolam tablets themselves, commonly sold as bars resembling the real prescription medication, presented the identical uniformity problem described in earlier segments, with the identical potentially fatal consequence when fentanyl was the adulterant rather than the advertised benzodiazepine, or in some documented cases when both substances appeared together in the same tablet. Combining an opioid with a benzodiazepine is considered dangerous even in carefully calibrated legitimate prescribing, because both drug classes suppress breathing through related but distinct mechanisms, and the combination compounds that suppression well beyond what either substance would produce alone. A counterfeit tablet doing this by accident, with no dosing intention behind it whatsoever, carries all of that compounded danger with none of the calibration. The counterfeit stimulant market, serving students seeking an edge before exams or a deadline, carried its own less publicized version of the same risk, since amphetamine-type stimulants are frequently adulterated with the same fentanyl supply chain feeding every other counterfeit product line, for the simple reason that the equipment, the presses, the dyes, the source chemicals overlap substantially regardless of which finished product is being imitated. A supplier running a single small operation might press several different counterfeit products from the same facility on the same equipment, using the same imprecise mixing methods across all of them, meaning the danger was never confined neatly to the oxycodone-shaped tablets that dominate headline coverage. What unites all of these variants ultimately is the same underlying economic logic driving the entire crisis. Whatever tablet shape commands demand, a counterfeiter with a press and a dye can produce, and the actual contents of that tablet were determined not by what was advertised but by whatever happened to be sitting in the mixing bowl that particular week. In 2022, seizures started turning up pills in an assortment of bright colours, and the story that ran through American media was that traffickers were making candy-coloured pills to target children, specifically at Halloween. It was a compelling story. It was also, in the assessment of most drug policy researchers who looked at it, largely wrong. Coloured pills appear to have been about brand differentiation and batch identification, the same reason your ibuprofen is a different colour from your antihistamine. No trafficking organisation has ever had a business model built on giving free product to 8-year-olds. But the panic was instructive, because it showed exactly which parts of this story America was prepared to believe. Trace the actual sequence of events, because it is a fairly clean case study in how a genuine underlying fact, coloured counterfeit pills genuinely existed and genuinely posed a real danger, can mutate into a specific and largely unsupported narrative once it passes through several rounds of media amplification. Law enforcement agencies issued legitimate public warnings after seizing brightly coloured counterfeit fentanyl pills, warnings intended reasonably to alert the public that fentanyl was not confined to a single recognisable appearance. Those warnings, arriving in the weeks before Halloween, were quickly reframed by portions of the media and by some officials themselves as a specific warning about candy-coloured pills being distributed to trick-or-treating children. Drug policy researchers who examined the actual seizure data and the actual economics of drug distribution found this specific framing difficult to square with how trafficking operations function. Illegal drugs, however produced, represent a product that traffickers have every incentive to sell rather than give away, and the described scenario, strangers distributing expensive fentanyl-laced product for free to random children who had never requested it and would never become paying customers, matched no known pattern of trafficking behaviour anywhere in the historical record. Coloured dyes, meanwhile, had a far more mundane and far better documented explanation readily available. The same reason pharmaceutical companies colour-code their own legitimate products, allowing different batches, different apparent potencies, or different intended products to be visually distinguished from one another at a glance, whether by the seller managing inventory or by the buyer trying to identify which product they had previously purchased. Subsequent seizure data bore out the more mundane explanation. Coloured counterfeit pills turned out to be pressed and sold year-round, with no meaningful seasonal spike around Halloween, and toxicology findings showed no pattern suggesting these pills were being distributed through anything resembling trick-or-treating, rather than through the same social media and peer-to-peer channels responsible for every other counterfeit pill in this story. None of which is to say the underlying danger was invented. Coloured fentanyl pills were real, dangerous, and genuinely seized in meaningful quantities, but the specific fear that briefly gripped the country of a stranger handing a poisoned candy-coloured pill to a child at the front door revealed something worth noting about which version of this crisis felt emotionally legible to the public, and which version, involving a teenager's own phone and a seller they had never met in person, felt somehow less vivid despite being, by every available measure, the far more common and far more accurately documented threat. The seizure numbers are the part that stops conversations. Federal agencies went from seizing counterfeit pills in the tens of thousands per year to the tens of millions, and then kept climbing until the annual figure was large enough that officials started describing it in terms of potential lethal doses rather than tablet counts, because tablet counts had stopped registering emotionally. And the thing to hold in your mind is that seizures are not a measure of how much is out there. They are a measure of how much is out there multiplied by how hard anyone was looking. A record seizure year can mean the flood got worse. It can also just mean the nets got bigger. Walk through the actual trajectory of these numbers for a moment, because the scale genuinely defies easy comprehension the way most very large statistics do. In the earlier years of the counterfeit pill crisis, federal seizures numbered in the tens of thousands of tablets annually, a figure large enough to alarm specialists but still small enough to describe individually, batch by batch, in agency reports. Within a handful of years, that figure had climbed into the tens of millions, an increase of roughly 1,000-fold, and agencies began supplementing the raw tablet count with an estimate of how many of those seized tablets, based on laboratory testing of representative samples, likely contained a potentially lethal dose. That secondary figure, expressed as potential deaths averted through seizure alone, regularly reached well into the tens of millions of doses in a single year. It is genuinely difficult to reason clearly about a number that large, and this is precisely where the methodological caveat becomes important rather than merely academic. Seizure statistics measure two entangled variables at once: the actual quantity of product moving through the illegal supply chain, and the actual capacity, funding, technology, and effort that law enforcement agencies devoted to finding it. A dramatic increase in seizures could mean the underlying flow of counterfeit pills increased dramatically. It could also mean that agencies received additional funding, adopted improved detection technology, or simply reprioritized enforcement resources toward this particular threat, catching a larger share of a supply that had not necessarily grown at the same rate the seizure numbers suggest. Researchers who study this distinction generally look for corroborating evidence beyond seizure counts alone, things like overdose death rates, hospital admission data, and toxicology testing at the population level, precisely because seizure numbers by themselves cannot cleanly separate supply growth from enforcement growth. In this particular case, the corroborating evidence rising overdose death through much of this period, followed by a genuine and significant decline beginning in late 2023, suggests the seizure trend was tracking something real about the underlying supply rather than reflecting enforcement effort alone, though most careful analysts caution that both factors were almost certainly operating simultaneously. What the seizure numbers convey most reliably, whatever their precise relationship to the true scale of the underlying supply, is the sheer volume of manufacturing capacity that had come online to meet a demand that, as the previous several segments established, was never particularly difficult to create once the crackdown of the earlier era left it standing there with nowhere else to go. There is a persistent image of how this crosses the border, and it involves a person walking through the desert with a bag. It is a vivid image and it is largely fiction. The overwhelming majority of fentanyl seized entering the United States is found at official ports of entry, in passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, driven by people with legal documents, moving through the same lanes as avocados and car parts. And the couriers are, in the large majority of cases, American citizens, because an American citizen crossing at an official port attracts less attention. It is not a smuggling operation in the cinematic sense. It is a logistics operation that has correctly identified where the bottleneck isn't. It is worth sitting with just how thoroughly this contradicts the image most people carry around without ever having examined it, an image built almost entirely from decades of film and television, rather than from any actual customs data. That cinematic picture, someone crossing open desert terrain on foot under cover of darkness, describes a smuggling method genuinely used for certain products at certain points in history, but it describes almost none of the actual fentanyl entering the country during this crisis. Federal seizure data, released repeatedly and consistently across multiple years, shows the overwhelming share of fentanyl interdictions occurring at legal ports of entry. The same crossings used every single day by ordinary commuters, commercial freight, and tourists. The reason for this, once you think about it from a purely logistical standpoint, is almost embarrassingly simple. A person crossing open terrain between ports of entry is visible from the air, trackable by sensors, and vulnerable to an entire dedicated enforcement apparatus built specifically around that terrain. A vehicle crossing at an official port of entry is one among tens of thousands crossing that same day, subject to inspection, yes, but inspection that cannot possibly examine every vehicle in detail without halting cross-border commerce entirely. Concealment methods have grown correspondingly sophisticated, product hidden inside vehicle door panels, gas tanks, spare tires, and manufactured cavities, requiring the kind of targeted intelligence-driven search that can only be applied to a small fraction of total crossing traffic. The demographic profile of who actually carries out this smuggling further undercuts the popular image. Court records and federal prosecutions from this period show that the individuals apprehended transporting fentanyl across ports of entry are, in the clear majority of documented cases, United States citizens, not the foreign nationals the popular narrative tends to picture. This makes a certain grim sense once you consider it from the trafficking organization's perspective. An American citizen driving a car with American plates and valid identification draws substantially less secondary scrutiny at a checkpoint than someone without those credentials, making citizens themselves, sometimes recruited through financial desperation and sometimes through direct coercion, the more efficient choice of courier. None of this is to say cross-border trafficking outside official checkpoints does not happen at all. Smaller quantities certainly move through remote terrain as well, but the volume, the overwhelming bulk of the actual supply feeding this crisis, moves through the front door, hidden inside vehicles driven by people who blend in perfectly, because blending imperfectly was always the entire strategy. Then there are the places where none of this is hidden at all. On certain blocks in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Phoenix, the counterfeit pill economy operates in daylight with the casual efficiency of a farmer's market. Prices are shouted, quantities are discussed, people sit on the curb because the alternative is standing. What's striking, if you've only encountered this through statistics, is how deeply boring it looks in person. There is no menace to it, no cinematic edge. It is just commerce, conducted by exhausted people, in front of a shuttered storefront at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. Journalists, researchers, and public health workers who have spent time actually observing these markets consistently describe the same disorienting experience, which is that the reality bears almost no resemblance to how drug markets are typically depicted in film or television. There is no dramatic tension, no furtive glances, no sense of danger crackling in the air. Transactions happen in full view of passing traffic, of storefronts, sometimes of police vehicles parked within sight of the exchange. The atmosphere is closer to a tired outdoor market running past its closing time than to anything resembling the popular image of an illegal drug transaction. Part of what makes this openness possible is a straightforward function of supply and demand operating at a scale where concealment has simply stopped being worth the effort. When a market becomes large enough, involving enough regular participants, Enough repeat transactions and enough tolerance from an enforcement apparatus stretched too thin to meaningfully disrupt it. Hiding the activity provides diminishing returns for the risk and effort involved. Everyone already knows what is happening on that block, including, often, the residents living directly above it, the shop owners across the street, and the city officials who have debated the corridor in public meetings for years. The particular corridor along Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia has become, somewhat unfortunately, the most photographed and most discussed example of this phenomenon nationally, in part because its scale and visibility make it an unusually legible case study for outside observers trying to understand a crisis that otherwise unfolds largely behind closed doors, in bedrooms and cars and apartments where nobody outside is watching. What visitors and researchers describe finding, there is not chaos in the dramatic sense, but something closer to a grinding, exhausted routine. People cycling through withdrawal and use on a schedule as regular and as joyless as a shift at a job nobody wanted. The presence of these markets also complicates any simple narrative about enforcement failing to notice or failing to try. Police departments in cities with visible open-air markets have run repeated enforcement operations against them, sometimes with real short-term effect on visible activity, and the markets have, without exception, reconstituted themselves within a matter of weeks or months, a pattern that speaks less to police incompetence than to the sheer scale and depth of the underlying demand these markets exist to serve. You can clear a block. You cannot, with a police operation alone, clear the physical dependency that repopulates it. Around 2019, medical examiners in Philadelphia started finding something unexpected in their toxicology reports, and it was a veterinary sedative called xylazine, approved for horses and cattle, and for no human being anywhere. It had been added to the supply, apparently to extend the duration of the fentanyl high, and it brought with it a set of problems that nobody had a protocol for. Xylazine is not an opioid, which means the standard overdose reversal medication does not touch it. It also causes severe skin wounds at sites nowhere near where it was injected, by a mechanism still not fully understood. Emergency departments found themselves treating a condition that did not exist in any textbook they owned. The initial discovery reads, in retrospect, like a small and easily missed detail that turned out to carry enormous consequence. Fentanyl's effects, however intense, tend to be relatively brief compared to some other opioids, and there is reasonable evidence to suggest that xylazine, when mixed into the supply, was intended to extend that duration, stretching a short high into a longer one and, from a purely commercial standpoint, making a given quantity of product feel more valuable to the buyer than fentanyl alone would provide. Whatever the original motivation, xylazine spread rapidly through the fentanyl supply in the northeastern United States over the following several years, showing up in toxicology testing with increasing frequency until it became, in some regions, present in a substantial majority of samples tested. The clinical problem this created cannot be overstated, because it broke the single most reliable emergency response tool available to anyone responding to a suspected overdose. Naloxone, the medication responsible for reversing countless opioid overdoses and for a meaningful share of the recent decline in overdose deaths, works by displacing opioids from their receptors in the brain, restoring normal breathing within minutes. Xylazine occupies an entirely different set of receptors, related to sedation through a mechanism more similar to certain blood pressure medications than to any opioid, which means naloxone has essentially no effect on it whatsoever. A person who has overdosed on a fentanyl and xylazine combination might partially respond to naloxone, addressing the opioid component while remaining deeply sedated and at continued risk from the xylazine that the medication cannot touch. The wound problem compounded the crisis in an entirely separate direction. Clinicians began documenting severe, slow-healing ulcerations and areas of dead tissue appearing on patients who used xylazine-adulterated drugs, wounds that in some cases appeared even at injection sites unrelated to where the drug had actually entered the body, suggesting some systemic effect on tissue and blood flow rather than simple local irritation. These wounds, left untreated, which happened frequently given how thoroughly this population tends to be excluded from routine medical care, progressed in some documented cases to require amputation, adding a form of chronic physical devastation to a crisis that had, until this point, been discussed almost entirely in terms of sudden death rather than prolonged injury. What makes the xylazine chapter such an important illustration of the broader pattern running through this whole story is how directly it repeats a lesson that should, by this point, feel painfully familiar. An unregulated supply chain will substitute, adulterate, and improvise without any obligation to inform the people consuming the result, and each substitution tends to outpace, by months or years, the medical system's ability to even recognize what it is now treating. If there is one lesson the last 15 years should have taught, it is that this supply chain adapts faster than the law that chases it, and the current evidence for that is a family of compounds called nitazines. They were synthesized in the 1950s as painkiller candidates, abandoned and forgotten in the literature for 60 years, and some of them are considerably more potent than fentanyl. They have now begun appearing in seized samples across Europe and North America. They exist for one reason, which is that they were not on any controlled substances schedule, because nobody had thought about them since Eisenhower. Prohibition is a game of scheduling, and the chemistry library is very, very large. The origin story of nitazines is, in its own quiet way, one of the stranger footnotes in 20th century pharmaceutical research. A Swiss pharmaceutical company synthesized a large family of these compounds during the 1950s, exploring them as potential painkillers, and abandoned nearly all of them before they ever reached clinical use, generally because their potency and side effect profile made them impractical or unsafe for the medical purposes they had been designed to serve. For roughly 6 decades afterward, they existed almost exclusively as entries in academic chemistry literature, cited occasionally in pharmacology research, entirely absent from any real-world drug supply, licit or otherwise, and correspondingly absent from the drug scheduling laws written during those same decades, since lawmakers can only schedule substances they know exist and have reason to worry about. That absence from scheduling lists is precisely what makes nitazines so significant now, and it illustrates with unusual clarity the specific mechanism by which prohibition-based drug policy tends to fall permanently one step behind. Drug scheduling law works, structurally, by identifying a specific chemical compound or a specific narrow class of compounds and declaring it illegal to manufacture, distribute, or possess. This approach functions reasonably well against a static, known threat, but it offers essentially no defense against a threat that has not yet been identified, because a compound cannot be scheduled before someone in a position of legal authority becomes aware that it poses a risk worth scheduling. Forensic laboratories in the United States and across Europe began detecting nitazines in seized drug samples with increasing frequency over the past several years, some variants tested as more potent by weight than fentanyl itself, meaning the already vanishingly small margin between an active dose and a fatal one narrows even further. Regulatory agencies have moved to schedule the specific nitazene variants identified so far, but the underlying chemical family described in that original 1950s, research contains dozens of related compounds, most of which have never been synthesized at scale, tested for potency, or examined by anyone since the original researchers set their notes aside decades ago. This is the uncomfortable structural truth sitting underneath the entire second half of this story. Prohibition, as currently practiced, is fundamentally reactive, capable of closing doors only after someone has already walked through them and been counted. The chemistry library, as the closing line puts it, really is very large, populated by decades of abandoned research sitting quietly in journals nobody outside a narrow specialty has read in 50 years, waiting for someone motivated enough and indifferent enough to the consequences to go looking. Not all of this story goes in one direction, and the counterweight comes in a small white cardboard box. Naloxone is an opioid antagonist that knocks fentanyl off the brain's receptors and restores breathing, usually within a couple of minutes, and it does approximately nothing to a person who has not taken opioids. It went over the counter in the United States in 2023, which meant a person could buy it in a drugstore next to the cough syrup without a conversation, a prescription, or a raised eyebrow. It sits in glove compartments, high school nurse offices, library front desks, and the bags of a great many parents who have never told anyone they are carrying it. The pharmacology behind naloxone is worth appreciating on its own terms because it represents a genuinely elegant solution to an otherwise devastating problem. Opioids, including fentanyl, produce their effects, both the intended pain relief and the dangerous suppression of breathing, by binding to specific receptors in the brain. Naloxone binds to those same receptors with even greater affinity, displacing the opioid already attached without activating the receptor itself, effectively switching the effect off rather than adding anything new. Administered as a nasal spray, requiring no needle, no specialized training, and no medical background whatsoever, it can restore normal breathing in someone who has stopped breathing due to an opioid overdose within a matter of minutes, frequently before emergency medical services would even have time to arrive. Its safety profile is what made the over-the-counter approval politically and medically feasible in the first place. Naloxone has essentially no effect on someone who has not taken opioids, which means there is minimal downside risk to widespread casual availability. A parent who administers it to a child experiencing a medical emergency unrelated to opioids will not cause harm by doing so. A bystander who misjudges a situation and administers it unnecessarily faces no meaningful consequence beyond the cost of the product itself. This combination, genuinely life-saving when needed, and essentially harmless when not, is rare enough in pharmacology that public health officials had been advocating for broader access literally for years before the regulatory approval finally arrived. The 2023 decision to allow over-the-counter sale removed the last meaningful barrier to that broader access, and the change in distribution patterns that followed was immediate and measurable. Naloxone began appearing in places it had never previously been stocked, as a matter of course: convenience stores, big box retailers, vending machines installed specifically for this purpose in some cities, and the personal bags of an enormous and largely invisible population of ordinary people, not medical professionals, not harm reduction workers, simply parents, teachers and co-workers who had decided quietly and without much fanfare that they wanted to be prepared. Public health researchers examining the decline in overdose deaths that began in late 2023 consistently identify expanded naloxone access as one of the most significant contributing factors alongside changes in the drug supply itself and expanded addiction treatment access. It is, in the truest sense, the counterweight this whole story has been missing until relatively recently. A genuinely simple, genuinely effective tool, finally made available at the exact scale the crisis had long demanded. Fentanyl test strips were originally designed as urine tests for hospitals, and somebody realized they would work just as well on a dissolved sample of the substance itself. Cheap, simple, roughly the sophistication of a home pregnancy test. And for years, in a large number of American states, they were illegal, because they met the statutory definition of drug paraphernalia, a category written in the 1970s to outlaw bongs. So a piece of paper that could tell a person their pill was not what they thought it was carried a criminal penalty, while the pill itself was available by text message. State after state has since carved out exemptions. It took on average about a decade per state to notice the problem. The technology itself is worth appreciating for how unglamorous and how thoroughly proven it already was before anyone thought to repurpose it for this use. These strips employ the same basic immunoassay chemistry found in a wide range of medical diagnostic tools, functioning through antibodies that bind specifically to the target substance and produce a visible color change on the strip in response. Hospitals had used essentially identical technology for years to detect fentanyl in patient urine samples as part of standard toxicology screening. Adapting the same chemistry to detect fentanyl dissolved in a small water sample taken from a pill or a powder required no significant new invention, only the recognition that an existing tool could serve an entirely new and considerably more urgent purpose. The legal obstacle that delayed widespread adoption of this straightforward technology deserves particular attention, because it illustrates how thoroughly outdated legal frameworks can undermine even the most uncontroversial public health interventions. Drug paraphernalia statutes in most states were written during the 1970s, defining paraphernalia broadly enough to cover any equipment primarily intended for use with a controlled substance. Language crafted with pipes, bongs, and rolling papers in mind, decades before anyone could have anticipated a testing strip whose entire purpose was to prevent harm rather than facilitate use. Because the statutory language focused on intended use rather than actual function, a strip designed explicitly to help someone avoid a fatal poisoning could be, and in numerous documented cases actually was, prosecuted under the same laws written to target items facilitating drug consumption. Harm reduction advocates spent years making the case, ultimately a fairly simple one once anyone with legislative authority actually examined it closely, that a tool allowing someone to test their own supply before using it reduces the likelihood of death without in any way encouraging or facilitating drug use itself, since the strip provides only information, leaving the decision of what to do with that information entirely up to the person holding it. State legislatures began passing specific exemptions removing fentanyl test strips from paraphernalia statutes starting in the later years of this crisis, and the pace of these exemptions accelerated considerably once the scale of counterfeit pill deaths became undeniable through sheer accumulated data. What remains striking, looking back at this particular chapter, is how little genuine controversy the underlying idea actually generated once legislators engaged with it directly. This was rarely a contested policy fight in the way many drug policy debates become. It was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, simply a matter of nobody having gotten around to updating a 50-year-old law to account for a piece of technology its original authors could never have imagined needing. Meanwhile, the medical system spent the decade oscillating wildly. Having spent the 90s and 2000s prescribing opioids with a generosity that now reads as deranged, it swung hard the other way, and a great many chronic pain patients on stable, functional, long-term regimens were tapered off abruptly by physicians terrified of their own licenses. Some of those patients went to the street. Buprenorphine, one of the most effective treatments for opioid dependence in existence, meanwhile sat behind a federal waiver requirement that limited how many patients a doctor could treat, a restriction that applied to no other medication and that took until 2023 to abolish. There was never a shortage of the tools, there was a shortage of permission. The pendulum swing described here followed a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched institutions overcorrect after a genuine failure, and it is worth walking through both ends of that swing to appreciate how thoroughly it failed patients in both directions. The overprescribing era of the 1990s and 2000s, driven partly by aggressive pharmaceutical marketing and partly by a genuine and well-intentioned medical movement to take chronic pain more seriously as a treatable condition, produced exactly the outcome this entire story has been tracing. A population of patients dependent on medications prescribed with far less caution than the drugs themselves warranted. The correction to that failure was in principle entirely appropriate. In practice, it was applied with a bluntness that made no meaningful distinction between patients who had developed a dependency through the very prescribing patterns being corrected and patients who had, for years, used opioid medication exactly as intended to manage genuine, severe, otherwise untreatable pain. Physicians facing new prescribing guidelines, increased scrutiny from state medical boards, and in some cases direct threats to their licenses if their prescribing patterns drew regulatory attention, responded understandably from a self-preservation standpoint by tapering patients rapidly, sometimes involuntarily, regardless of how stable or how functional those patients had been on their existing regimen. Multiple studies conducted during this period documented worse outcomes among rapidly tapered chronic pain patients, including increased rates of suicidal ideation, increased illicit opioid use, and in some tracked cohorts, increased mortality. A genuinely tragic irony given that these tapering decisions were made explicitly in the name of safety. The buprenorphine restriction represents perhaps the starkest example of institutional friction actively working against the interests of the crisis it was ostensibly trying to address. Buprenorphine, a medication with strong clinical evidence supporting its effectiveness in treating opioid use disorder, reducing both illicit use and overdose mortality among patients who take it, required physicians to complete additional federal training and obtain a special waiver before they were permitted to prescribe it, and even waivered physicians faced strict caps on how many patients they could treat simultaneously, a restriction that applied to no other controlled substance of comparable risk profile. This bureaucratic bottleneck persisted for years, even as the overdose crisis worsened, finally eliminated by federal legislation only in 2023. By which point an entire additional wave of preventable deaths had already occurred. The through line connecting both halves of this oscillation is not malice or indifference, but something more mundane and, in its own way, more frustrating. Institutions responding to genuine failures with policies calibrated for the previous crisis, rather than the one actually unfolding in front of them, correcting overprescribing so aggressively that they punished patients who had never been part of the problem, while simultaneously restricting access to the one medication proven to help the patients who genuinely needed treatment. Something else changed in these years, quietly, and you can hear it if you read enough obituaries. Families began writing the real cause of death into the newspaper. Not passed away unexpectedly, not died at home, but the actual word, followed frequently by a sentence about the pill being counterfeit and a plea for the reader to talk to their kids. There are now organizations run entirely by parents who did not know each other before, whose entire function is to stand in school gymnasiums with a photograph and explain what an M30 looks like. It is the oldest form of public health there is. It is people who lost someone refusing to be quiet about the shape of it. This shift in how families chose to talk about these deaths represents a genuine and significant break from decades of prior convention around drug-related mortality, and it is worth understanding what that convention had been in order to appreciate how deliberately it was being abandoned. For generations, obituaries mentioning a death connected to substance use overwhelmingly relied on euphemism, language crafted, understandably, to protect a grieving family from the particular stigma that has historically attached itself to addiction more than to almost any other cause of death. Died suddenly, died at home, died unexpectedly. Phrases that conveyed loss without conveying cause allowed families privacy at a moment when privacy felt like the only mercy still available to them. What changed, gradually and then quite visibly, was a growing number of families making the deliberate choice to abandon that privacy in favor of specificity, writing obituaries that named fentanyl directly, that explained the deceased had taken what they believed to be a legitimate prescription pill, and that closed with a direct appeal to readers to have a conversation with their own children before it was too late. This was not a change driven by any single organization or campaign. It emerged, largely independently, from thousands of individual families arriving at similar conclusions around the same time, a genuinely grassroots shift in how an entire category of death was being publicly narrated. Out of that same grief, a number of parent-led organizations formed. Most of them started by people with no prior background in public health advocacy, simply parents who had lost a child and decided the most useful thing they could do with that loss was prevent it from happening to someone else's. These organizations developed a specific and remarkably consistent public health methodology, almost by instinct, visiting schools, bringing photographs of their own children alongside physical replicas or images of the actual counterfeit pills involved, walking students through exactly what an M30 looks like, exactly how it is obtained, and exactly why it cannot be trusted regardless of its appearance. There is something worth noting about the particular power of this specific form of advocacy, delivered not by a government agency or a curriculum designer, but by a parent standing in a gymnasium holding a photograph of their own child. It carries an authority that no institutional campaign, however well-funded or well-researched, can fully replicate, because it demonstrates, in the most immediate and undeniable way possible, that the statistic under discussion was, until recently, an actual person with a name, a room, and a family that has not stopped grieving. And then, starting in late 2023, the numbers did something they had not done in 30 years. They went down, and they kept going down. American overdose deaths peaked at around 110,000 in a single year, fell by roughly a quarter in 2024, to about 80,000, and fell again in 2025 to around 70,000, the lowest figure since before the pandemic. Researchers are still arguing about why. Naloxone saturation, treatment access, changes in the potency of the supply itself, and the bleakest explanation of all, which is that the population most at risk has already been thinned. Probably all of them, certainly not just one. It is worth sitting with the scale of this decline for a moment, because a drop of this magnitude sustained across multiple consecutive years has genuinely no precedent in the recorded history of American overdose statistics. Overdose deaths had climbed, with only brief and minor interruptions, for essentially the entire preceding 3 decades, driven successively by prescription opioids, then heroin, then fentanyl, each wave larger than the one before it. The idea that the underlying trend could reverse this sharply and hold that reversal across successive years rather than representing a single anomalous data point would have struck most researchers working in this field as implausible as recently as 2022. The explanations researchers have offered and continue to actively debate each carry genuine supporting evidence without any single one fully accounting for the magnitude of the decline on its own. Naloxone saturation, discussed in an earlier segment, correlates temporally with the decline in a way that makes a meaningful causal contribution highly plausible, given how directly the medication interrupts the specific mechanism, respiratory suppression, that fentanyl overdoses depend on to become fatal. Expanded treatment access, including the removal of the buprenorphine prescribing restrictions discussed 2 segments ago, offers another plausible and evidence-supported contributor, since more people receiving effective medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder should, in principle, translate directly into fewer overdose deaths within that treated population. Some researchers have also pointed to changes within the illicit supply itself, evidence in certain regions suggesting the average potency of street fentanyl may have decreased somewhat compared to the earlier peak years of the crisis, for reasons that remain only partially understood, but may relate to shifts in how traffickers are cutting and distributing product. And then there is the explanation that researchers raise carefully, almost reluctantly, because of how bleak its implications are, that a genuinely significant portion of the population most vulnerable to fatal overdose, individuals with the least stable housing, the most severe and longest-running dependency, the least access to any of the interventions described above, may have already died during the peak years of this crisis, meaning some share of the current decline reflects not lives saved through intervention, but a smaller remaining population left to die. Most researchers examining this question conclude that no single explanation accounts for the full decline, and that naloxone treatment access, supply changes, and this darker demographic explanation are most likely all operating simultaneously, in proportions nobody has yet managed to fully untangle. So here you are, back in your own bed, in your own decade, with a bathroom cabinet full of things that are exactly what the label says they are. And that is the quiet, enormous thing this whole story is actually about. Not chemistry, not cartels, not policy. Trust. The entire pharmaceutical system, the whole vast apparatus of licensing and inspection, and lot numbers and little stamped letters in little stamped boxes exists, so that a person can swallow a small object without conducting an investigation first. What the Blues did was counterfeit the trust, and the pill was just the delivery mechanism. Everything else in this story is the sound of a country finding out what that trust was worth. Think back for a moment, across everything this evening has walked you through. A reformulated tablet designed with genuinely good intentions, a strip mall pipeline that ran wide open for a decade because 2 databases never learned to speak to each other, a molecule invented to make surgery survivable, a machine no more exotic than a kitchen appliance, a bowl stirred by hand, a colour chosen with more care than the ingredient that actually mattered, a teenager with a phone already open to the app everyone their age already uses. None of these individual pieces examined in isolation look like the origin of a catastrophe. Each one on its own looks almost mundane. That, more than anything else, may be the most unsettling thread running underneath this entire story. Nothing about it required a single dramatic villain, only a long chain of small, individually explicable failures, each one reasonable from the vantage point of whoever made it, compounding into something that, from any distance at all, is very hard to look at directly. And yet the story does not end where it began, in the dark, uncertain years when nobody quite understood what was happening or why. It ends, at least for now, with a curve bending downward for the first time in 3 decades, with naloxone sitting in glove compartments across the country, with test strips finally legal in the states that spent a decade treating them like contraband, with parents standing in school gymnasiums holding photographs and refusing to let a euphemism carry the weight their child's actual death deserved. None of that undoes what has already happened. All of it together represents something that this particular crisis went a remarkably long time without. People paying attention, on purpose, to the actual mechanism rather than the comfortable story. So tonight, as you drift off in a room where the pills in your own cabinet are exactly what they claim to be, made in a facility someone actually inspected, mixed by a machine actually calibrated to the microgram, maybe spare a thought for how much invisible machinery it takes to make that ordinary trust possible, and how quickly, how quietly, an entire supply chain figured out how to counterfeit it. Sleep well. The blue on your nightstand, if you have any, is exactly what the box says it is. So there you are. The end of the night, the end of the story, and the end of a very long journey that began, if you think back to where we started, with a single object smaller than a shirt button. That is worth holding onto for a moment before you drift off, because it is genuinely one of the stranger things about everything you've just listened to. Every catastrophe has a shape, and most of the ones history hands us are enormous. Wars have fronts hundreds of miles wide. Plagues sweep across continents. Famines empty entire regions and leave marks on the land you can still see from an airplane 6 centuries later. This one had none of that. This one fit in a coin pocket. You could hold 100 of them in one closed fist, and nobody walking past you on the street would notice a thing. And yet somewhere around 300,000 Americans died in the years this story covers, most of them from something they could have swallowed without a glass of water. Let that settle for a second. Not because it is a number worth being frightened by at bedtime, but because it is a number worth respecting, the way you respect the depth of water you're standing beside. There is a certain kind of understanding that only arrives when you sit still with a fact instead of scrolling past it, and you have just spent several hours sitting still with this one. That counts for something. That is, in its own quiet way, the entire reason to listen to a story like this at all. Think back over the ground we covered tonight. We started in a boardroom in Connecticut in the year 2010, where a group of reasonably intelligent people looked at a genuine problem and engineered a genuine solution to exactly one half of it. They made a pill harder to crush. They did not make anybody less dependent on it. And so the dependency, which had never once agreed to be part of their plan, simply stood up, put on its coat, and went looking for another door. We followed it down the interstate to Florida, to strip malls with bulletproof glass in the reception window and parking available out back, where a person could visit 4 clinics in an afternoon because no 2 computers in the entire state had been introduced to each other. We watched that pipeline get shut down, properly and forcefully and with real courage on the part of the people who did it, and we watched the shutdown accomplish precisely what a shutdown can accomplish, which is the removal of a supply and precisely nothing of what it cannot, which is the removal of the need. We crossed the bridge into heroin, walked by hundreds of thousands of people who had begun this whole journey with a back injury and a prescription pad and a doctor who genuinely believed he was helping. We met a molecule invented in 1959 by a Belgian chemist who was trying, and this deserves to be said again as the night winds down, to make surgery survivable. He succeeded. Paul Janssen is one of the reasons an operation you or someone you love may one day need will be something you sleep through rather than something you endure. Nothing in this story is his fault. Nothing in this story is even, strictly speaking, fentanyl's fault. It is a good drug that does an enormous amount of good every single day in rooms full of people wearing gloves and reading monitors. We watched what happened when it left those rooms. We looked at the machine, and the machine turned out to be boring. That was somehow the worst part. Not a laboratory full of humming equipment behind a retinal scanner, just a squat metal thing you could buy without a license, fitted with a little steel stamp that somebody machined to order, the way you might order a custom cookie cutter. We looked at the bowl, the cement mixer, the chocolate chips scattered unevenly through the dough, some cookies getting 3 and some getting 20, and nobody in the room, including the person doing the stirring, having the faintest idea which was which. We did the arithmetic of the microgram and found that the entire difference between an ordinary night and the last one can be measured in something smaller than a grain of salt. We watched the colour get more attention than the contents. We followed the pills onto phones, into apps designed for sending pictures of dogs, sold through a vocabulary of little cartoon symbols that changed every time somebody noticed them. We sat with the hardest part of the whole story, which is the teenagers, and with the statistic that should not have been possible. Fewer kids using, more kids dying, a shape that only makes sense if the thing they were taking had quietly stopped being the thing they thought it was. And then, slowly, we watched the other side of the ledger begin to fill in. A nasal spray in a small white cardboard box, harmless to anyone who does not need it, decisive for anyone who does, finally sold over the counter next to the cough syrup where it should have been all along. A paper strip with the technology of a home pregnancy test, illegal for a decade in half the country because of a law written in the 1970s to outlaw bongs and then, state by state, unbanned by legislators who read the actual argument and found there was not much to argue about. A federal restriction on the single most effective treatment for opioid dependence, a restriction that applied to no other medication in the pharmacy, quietly abolished in 2023 after years of doing nothing but harm, and parents, an enormous, uncounted, largely invisible army of parents standing in school gymnasiums with a photograph in one hand and a pill in the other, explaining to a room of restless 15-year-olds what an M30 looks like. None of them asked for this job. None of them had any background in public health. They simply took the worst thing that has ever happened to them and turned it into a warning, because that was the only useful thing left to do with it. That is the oldest form of medicine there is. Long before laboratories, long before antibiotics, long before anybody understood why anything worked, human beings kept each other alive by telling each other what had happened. Do not eat that. Do not drink from there. Do not walk that path after dark. Somebody died learning it, and so somebody else lived by hearing it. Every one of those parents standing in a gymnasium is doing exactly what our ancestors did around a fire 10,000 years ago, and it works for exactly the same reason it worked then. And then, at the very end, the curve bent. Do not let that detail slide past you, because it is genuinely remarkable and it is genuinely rare. American overdose deaths had climbed more or less without pause for 3 decades. 3 decades. long enough that an entire generation of public health researchers built their careers inside a trend that only ever went one direction. And then, starting in late 2023, the number went down, and then it went down again, and then it went down a third time, to a level not seen since before the pandemic. Nobody's entirely sure why, and the honest researchers say so out loud. Some of it is naloxone in glove compartments. Some of it is treatment finally reaching people who had spent years being told to wait. Some of it may be changes in the supply itself, and some of it, the part nobody says without lowering their voice, may be that the people most at risk had already been lost. Probably all of it. Almost certainly not just one thing. History rarely turns on a single cause, no matter how much we would like it to, and anyone who tells you they have found the one lever that fixed this is selling something. But the curve bent. After 30 years, in a country that had more or less resigned itself to the idea that this number simply went up forever, it bent. And it bent because tens of thousands of unremarkable people did tens of thousands of unremarkable things. A pharmacist stocked the spray. A legislator read a bill about paper strips and thought, well, that seems obvious. A doctor completed a course. A mother stood up in front of a gymnasium with shaking hands. A friend at a party made someone else stay the night instead of driving home. None of it made the news. All of it added up. That is what progress actually looks like, almost always. Not a breakthrough, not a hero, just an enormous number of ordinary people, each doing one small correct thing in the same direction for long enough. So what do you take from all this, lying there in the dark with your fan running and your blanket pulled up? Not fear. Please, not fear. Fear is a bad night's sleep and a worse public health strategy. And if you have spent the last few hours getting quietly alarmed about the contents of your own medicine cabinet, let me put that down gently for you right now. The pills in your bathroom, filled at a pharmacy, dispensed from a labelled bottle with a lot number on the side, are exactly what the label says they are. That is not luck. That is not optimism. That is the end result of a system so thorough and so relentlessly boring that you have never once had to think about it. And that, in the end, is the actual thing worth being grateful for tonight. Because here is what this entire story has really been about. Underneath the chemistry and the cartels and the policy failures, trust, the most invisible infrastructure human beings have ever built. Consider what you did today without thinking about it even once. You drank water from a tap and did not test it. You ate food from a package and did not inspect the facility. You crossed a bridge and did not check the welds. You took a medication, perhaps, and did not verify a single thing about where it came from. You did all of this because somewhere behind each of those acts is a long chain of strangers who checked it first, most of whom you will never meet, none of whom you will ever thank, all of whom went to work today and did an unglamorous job correctly. Medieval peasants, if you have listened to some of the older nights on this channel, could trust almost nothing. Not the water, not the bread, not the meat, not the medicine, not the person selling them any of it. Every single thing that entered their body was a small, unverified gamble, and an enormous amount of their suffering came down to exactly that. What separates you from them is not intelligence, and it is not courage. It is a filing cabinet. It is an inspector. It is a lot number. It is a calibrated machine in a clean room, run by somebody who will never be famous, mixing a compound to a tolerance measured in fractions of a milligram, because that is the standard, and the standard is the whole point. The counterfeit pill did not really counterfeit oxycodone. It counterfeited that. It stole the trust and left the chain behind, and everything that followed was a country discovering, in the most expensive way imaginable, precisely what that trust had been worth all along. So the gratitude tonight is not for comfort exactly, it is for verification. For the astonishing, unappreciated, deeply unsexy fact that you live inside a system where things are usually what they say they are, and that when they are not, a laboratory somewhere will find out and somebody will be told. And now, before you go under, spare a thought for the people in this story who did not get that. Not as statistics. You have heard enough statistics tonight to last a while, and numbers that large stop meaning anything to the human mind somewhere around the second comma. Think instead about one person, because that is the only scale any of us can actually feel. A 19-year-old with a math final in the morning and his study aid from a friend of a friend. A woman in her 40s whose back never healed right after the warehouse years, tapered off in 6 weeks by a doctor who was frightened, doing the arithmetic on her kitchen table at 2 a.m. A man who'd been clean for 11 months and relapsed once, the way people sometimes do, on a supply that had changed completely while he was away. A 16-year-old with a panic attack and a chemistry test and a friend who said this will help you sleep. None of them were reckless in any way you or I have not been reckless. That is the part worth carrying out of tonight. Not one of these people was doing something that previous generations had not done 100 million times and survived. What changed was not their judgment. What changed was the object in their hand, silently, with no warning printed anywhere on it, in a way no amount of ordinary caution could have detected. That is not a moral failing. That is a betrayal of a very specific kind, and it happened to them, and it did not happen to you. And the only real difference between those two sentences is timing and luck and a supply chain nobody consulted them about. So be gentle with them tonight, in your thinking, and be gentle with the people still living inside this, the ones on the corners in Philadelphia and Phoenix and Los Angeles, sitting on curbs at 11 a.m. because standing is harder than it used to be. They were somebody's kid too. Most of them started somewhere entirely ordinary, with an injury or a prescription or a bad year, and then the arithmetic of dependency took over and stopped asking their opinion about anything. Nobody in this story woke up one morning and chose it. That is worth remembering the next time it comes up in conversation, and it will come up, and you will now know considerably more about it than whoever brought it up, and be gentle with yourself too while you are at it. Because there is a version of listening to a story like this that leaves a person feeling small and helpless, and I would rather not send you into sleep carrying that. So here is the honest counterweight, and it is not a platitude. Almost everything that bent the curve was small. That is not a consolation prize. That is the actual mechanism. Nobody solved this. There was no summit, no breakthrough, no single piece of legislation that turned it around. What happened was that a very large number of people each did one modest, achievable, deeply unheroic thing, and those things accumulated until a 30-year trend reversed itself. You can be one of those people with almost no effort at all. You can know what naloxone is, which you now do. You can know it is sold over the counter, which you now do. You can know that it does nothing to a person who does not need it and everything for a person who does. You can mention that once to someone who has a teenager, in the same tone you would mention where the fire extinguisher lives. That is the whole ask. That is genuinely the entire ask. That is how the oldest medicine works. Somebody tells somebody else what happened, and somebody who is going to be a statistic becomes a person who had a bad night instead. Now, let your shoulders drop. The story is over. and it ended better than it started, which is more than a great many nights on this channel can say. We have spent evenings together in medieval huts where the ending was simply winter, and in tombs where the ending was silence, and in prisons where the ending was a rope. Tonight we spent several hours inside something genuinely terrible, and the last chapter, against every reasonable expectation, was a number going down. That is not nothing. In fact, in the long, stubborn, extremely unglamorous history of human beings trying to keep each other alive, that is very close to everything. People are ridiculous. We have established this across many nights. We build enormously complex systems and then forget to make two of the databases talk to each other. We solve half a problem brilliantly and walk away from the other half. We write a law about bongs in the 1970s and accidentally criminalize a life-saving paper strip for 50 years. We are magnificent at engineering and catastrophic at follow-through, and we always fight the last crisis instead of the current one. But we also invent the reversal spray, and we also put it on the shelf next to the cough syrup, and we also stand up in a gymnasium with a photograph of our own child and talk to a room full of strangers' children over and over in town after town for years because it might work on one of them. Stubborn, hopeful, and kind of ridiculous. That has been the finding of every single one of these nights, and this one did not change it. So tonight, as you lie there in a clean bed, in a heated room, in a body that has been vaccinated against things that used to empty entire villages, with clean water 20 steps away and a bottle in the cabinet that contains precisely and only what the label promises, take one slow breath and appreciate the machinery. Not the dramatic machinery, not the surgeries and the space telescopes, the boring machinery, the inspector, the lot number, the calibrated mixer, the person you will never meet who checked the batch this morning, found it uniform, signed the form and went to lunch. That is what keeps you safe. It is not exciting and it never makes the news, and it is quite possibly the greatest thing our species has ever built. The fan is still humming, the lights are still low, your feet are warm and nothing in this room is trying to poison you, which is, historically speaking, an extraordinary luxury, and one that 100 billion human beings before you never once experienced. Let the story go now. You have carried it long enough for one evening. Let the boardroom go, and the strip mall, and the interstate, and the bowl, and the press, and the little blue tablet with the letter stamped into it that meant nothing at all where it came from. Let the numbers go, all of them, the ones that went up and the ones that finally went down. They will still be there tomorrow, and tomorrow you will know something about them that you did not know this morning, which is the only real reason any of us listen to stories about the past in the first place. Somewhere tonight, a curve is still bending. Somebody is stocking a shelf. Somebody is carrying a small white box in a bag and hoping never to open it. Somebody is standing in a gymnasium tomorrow morning, rehearsing what they're going to say about their son. And somewhere much closer than that, in a room with a fan running, you're finally properly warm and tired and safe. Sleep well. Thank you for staying up with me. I will see you next time.